Well, hello everyone and happy Tuesday. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Donna Riccobono. I'm Project Director of the Maryland and DC Deafblind Project, which we're titled Connections Beyond Sight and Sound. Welcome on this Tuesday afternoon. Hopefully it's bright and sunny wherever you are. It is over here in Maryland. So today's topic for our webinar this month is ensuring meaningful access for students with cortical visual impairment. And we're so honored to have Stephanie Steffer here with us today from Cvi Connect.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to go ahead and, can you give me the ability to share my screen?
Yeah.
Yes, I got that. One sec.
Stephanie is from Michigan. She earned her degree from Eastern Michigan University in special ed and visual impairments in early childhood. She is also Perkins-Roman Cvi Range endorsed. And she has a plethora of experience that she will discuss with you. Today is going to be focused on what happens after you've completed the necessary assessments, using the data to get started on bridging the gap and creating activities. So she will talk about that and the learning objectives for today. So we're going to ask and just make sure that everyone is on mute and that you turn your cameras off. We will be monitoring the chat box, so we will go ahead and help with questions and let Stephanie know that there's questions in the chat box. And we are recording this today, just so everybody is aware. We usually do when we do our monthly webinars, then we go ahead and post it on our website. And if you have any questions for myself, Jen Willis is the project coordinator. Rebecca Hammer is an educational specialist, so is Dr. Jenny Stefanik, and Sherry Dowling is here supporting us as well. So if you have any questions for us, please feel free to use the chat box or feel free to email us, however you'd like. So, Stephanie, if you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Recording in progress.
Well, thank you again so much for having me. It's truly an honor and a privilege to be here with you guys. And hopefully I can answer all the questions that you might have and make sure we can get to all of our intended goals for today's session. As you guys heard, I have some experience as a teacher consultant for the visually impaired in Michigan for about 10 years. I had the opportunity to train with Dr. Christine Roman Lancy here in Michigan when we were doing some mentor training through the Michigan Department of Ed Low Incident Outreach. And through that and my experiences, I was able to apply and receive the Perkins-Roman CVI endorsed professional certificate that Perkins used to offer. So with that, and then I also run a camp for youth who are blind and visually impaired here in Michigan for about 11 years. So that's just a little bit about me. I would love to know who's with us today, so feel free in the chat if you guys would like to. I'm all about participating and having you guys kind of join into the conversation as we go through. So feel free to, I have the chat box open and I'll do my best to kind of monitor that, as well as have these lovely ladies help me out with that as well. But feel free to type in the chat where you're from, what's your role with your CVI learner. Are you an educator? In what capacity? You know, are you a classroom teacher? Are you a speech language pathologist, teacher for the visually impaired, orientation mobility specialist? And that just kind of helps me give examples that you might be able to relate to. And I'll do my best to pull from my background and help it make it a little bit more meaningful for you. Thanks everybody for chiming in. Oh, we got TBIs, parents, TA, awesome. Early intervention. I do have some early intervention experience myself as well. Early childhood endorsed here in Michigan as well. Awesome. Some SLPs, O&M and Braille list. Amazing. And we got people from all over the place. We have Pediatric U with us today. Thank you. All right, great. You keep going and chiming in with those. I'm going to go on to our goals for the day just to kind of keep things going, but I am watching those continuously popping up. So today, like we said, our session is ensuring access or meaningful access for students with CVI. And the three things that we're going to kind of hit into are first looking at when you're given an activity to make sure that we are looking at what phase in CVI it's most appropriate for. And then the next thing that we're going to look at is looking at the given activity and figuring out within that phase, what is it most appropriate for a student? So are we looking at it as more of like a warm-up activity, or is it more geared towards access? What's the meaning of this activity? How is it being utilized? And then lastly, we're going to give you I'll give you some examples of activities that were given to me, and we'll discuss, what are some ways we could make this meaningful and accessible, and actually give examples and kind of go through that process to kind of make it a little bit more meaningful. It's so exciting to see some familiar names joining us. Thank you. So before we go any further into CVI and our roles as many educators, whether you're in the home or you are in the classroom, or a little bit of both, it is really important for us to understand what the federal law states. And so IDEA is our federal law, and this is going to be for our 3 and up. So this doesn't cover the birth to 3 because not every state offers that. But if your state, like Michigan, offers the early childhood education, you also have access to your family programs and services. But that looks a little bit different from state to state, okay? So keeping that in mind, I did highlight a few portions of this, but I also have available the full document. So if you have access to the PowerPoint, you should have access to this link as well. And it's an Osap policy letter that was sent out from the United States Department of Ed in regards to a student in 2014. So definitely some time, but the law hasn't changed since then. And I think that this is an amazing example of, and it's not scrolling for me. There we go. Okay. Technology at its finest sometimes. All right, it's not scrolling the way it normally does, but we'll make it work. Okay, so essentially this parent reached out and they were looking to get qualification for their child who had a cortical visual impairment. And I think what's really important is that the definition here, right here in this statement from Osap, says that you may not exclude a child with convergence and insufficiency or other visual impairments from meeting IDEA's definition of visual impairment, including blindness, if that condition, even with correction, adversely affects the child's educational performance, the child's ability to read and write. Okay, and then this next process, this next paragraph here goes into how we determine that, right? So you're looking for that adverse impact. Now, I'm guessing most of you here today are, I'm kind of preaching to the choir, right? You guys are all like, yeah, we know CVI is definitely negatively impacting the child's ability to access their curriculum. But I think it's just really important for you to know this language and this verbiage so that we can not only advocate for what we're doing, but also teaching the student to advocate for themselves and the families to help advocate for themselves too. And so that's why I like to go over this and making sure that you are aware of what are our responsibilities in school for these learners and where does this come from? So we know that there's that adverse impact, but how do we prove it? Because everything's got to be data driven. Everything has to have that database background. So in order to do that in education, we need to do a couple of things. So we need to look at field, so visual field to 50 degrees or less. And you're also looking for a degenerative condition, but essentially you're looking for that condition that adversely affects the child's educational performance. So if the eligibility team were to conclude that the child's vision difficulties do not fall within the state's criteria or conditions, then the child, oh, where did it go? Ah, my pages are all messed up. I'm so sorry, everybody. Okay, so you're looking for that database decision. I'm just going to summarize it for you. We're looking for that database decision model. We're looking for the evidence to show that it does, in fact, negatively impact their education. And that's where your functional vision evaluation is going to come into play to show that information. In our world of cortical visual impairment, we use the Cvi Range as our functional vision evaluation. Here it is, the functional vision assessment. And you're measuring the extent of the child's visual impairment and its effects on the ability to learn to read, write, and do mathematical calculations, and use computers and other assistive technology, as well as the child's ability to be involved in and make progress in the general curriculum offered to non-disabled students. That is the extent of which you're looking at. We're not just looking at, can the child do one of these things? We need to be looking at how the impact is throughout their entire educational day and how that is being impacted by this cortical visual impairment or other visual impairment in general. So just by, even if they don't have that diagnosis, you should still be able to look at these eligibility criteria. There should be nothing in there that says you have to have a diagnosis of in order to get qualified. That language at the state level is more restrictive than IDEA and is actually against the law. So something to look into in your state to see how that's worded. There have been a lot of states, I know Michigan rewrote theirs recently to make sure that it more thoroughly reflected the US Department of Education's IDEA guidelines. So now that we know that, I also want to make sure we're on the same page because there's all kinds of sessions out there for quote unquote CVI. And when I say CVI, I am talking about cortical visual impairment, but there is cerebral visual impairment. So I want to make sure that we are all on the same page. And one of the things that I want you guys to know is, to me, they are not interchangeable. They're not the same thing, okay? And so according to Dr. Roman's text, cerebral is defined as encompassing all forms of visual processing disorder, including those that have been associated with visual perceptual difficulties. To that same note in her text, the cortical visual impairment is defined as the brain damage or conditions that affect the part of the brain known as the posterior visual system, okay? And so to this, when I'm looking at CVI, I'm looking for those three elements to define the cortical visual impairment. So the first thing that I'm going to look for is an eye exam that does not explain the individual's functional use of vision. The second thing that I'm going to look for is the history of a brain condition, trauma, or damage associated with CVI. And then lastly, I'm going to look for the presence of a certain visual and behavioral characteristics. So I'm hoping that you guys are all very familiar with the 10 visual and behavioral characteristics. We are going to talk a lot about those today and their impact in the decisions we're making in order to provide access. But I think it's important that as we dive in, we are all now on the same page. We know which kids we're talking about. We know that we have got this child in front of us who the doctors are saying one thing, but the vision isn't really lining up with that, and we're just not making sense of it. They've had some type of trauma to the brain that may have caused the cortical visual impairment, and they're demonstrating these 10 visual and behavioral characteristics. We're getting a Cvi range profile for them to understand where they're at on this Cvi range. To quote Dr. Roman, the work of those who teach children with CVI is to systematically provide adaptations and specifically design instruction that will develop and broaden the child's representations. Today, we will focus on these accommodations to provide access. And while you may have a student who also requires modifications, that's not our focus today. So we're going to focus on the accommodations that our children need, these adaptations to the materials to make sure they have access to the instruction. So I, as an educator, was very driven into data-driven instruction. I was always, my first couple administrators that I have really drilled that into me. And I'm really glad they did, because it's turned me into the educator I am today. And I think that's really helped me understand my kids with CVI in this full picture. So this wheel was given to me in a presentation early on in my career, and I've kind of always referred back to it. And so we're going to start with this collect data tab at the top, okay? But as you go around the wheel, we see analyze data, make instructional decisions, plan, reflect, and repeat. But we're going to start with the collect data. So in order for us to figure out where we're going, we must know where we are, right? To do this, we use the Cvi Range. So it's our functional vision evaluation, as I mentioned earlier. In case you're not familiar, there are tons of resources out there, and I'm not going to get into how to score or anything like that, but I want you to make sure that we're all knowing what this tool is, because it's the foundation moving forward in the rest of this presentation. So you have your 3 parts. You'll complete with your observation, your parent interview, and your direct assessment. And then when you're done completing both rating 1 and rating 2, those forms, you'll get 2 scores, and you'll report both scores. That's your range, okay? And you'll get a score that'll score between the 0 and the hypothetical 10. And then that's where your student scores on the Cvi Range, right? So that is their Cvi Range score. Make sure you're reporting, again, that you're reporting both scores. Okay, now that we've collected our data, we're going to quickly jump over to analyze data. This is where we're going to start diving really deep into today's presentation. So we have our rating 1 and our rating 2. We can look at this page here is the rating 2 assessment page that you can find in Dr. Roman's textbooks. This screenshot is actually from Cvi Connect online. We have the Cvi Range paperwork available that you can complete it all online. But I have this screenshot here because I want to make note to all of you, in case you haven't heard, that the Cvi Range rating 1 is known for the child's present level, and rating 2 is the child's needs for accommodation, okay? Jumping back over, this slide chart probably is a little bit out of order, so I apologize for that. You have your two scores, right? From rating 1 and rating 2, that's giving you their range. If those scores fall between a 0 and a 3, that puts your child in phase 1. And the goal of this phase is to build consistent visual behavior. If your student scores be above a 3 to a 7, you're in phase 2. And the goal here is to integrate vision with function. And then if a student is scoring above a 7, your phase is phase 3, and your goal here is to facilitate the refinement of the characteristics. And so from the Cvi Range, we are able to place these children in these different phases, and you might see a bunch of activities that are kind of coming up across and say, oh, this is a phase 1 activity, this is a phase 1 activity. I know in Cvi Connect, we group our things by phases, but it's really important that we understand that even though that kind of clusters things into somewhat of a realm, Dr. Roman will caution us to say that 2 kids, even with the exact same score, don't have the exact same needs. Think about all 10 characteristics and how they can all vary so differently. And you're looking at rating 2 and how their scores might pop up down across that range differently. And so for that reason, even though both kids might be in the same phase and even have the same score, that doesn't mean they're going to need the exact same accommodations when it comes to creating activities. And that gets a little bit tricky when you're trying to address all of your students on your caseload and all of the needs that they might have, and making sure they all have access, right? So each kid, even though they score the exact same, might need completely different things. And so it's really important that we understand the goals of the phases so we can at least understand what is the purpose behind what we're doing and how it relates to what we're expecting from the student, as well as how do we need to modify that maybe to meet the student's specific needs. So that's where I would go into the note that the rating 2 is the child's accommodations, or their needs that they have. So if we look at that, in Dr. Roman's text, she gives us that Cvi Progress Chart, and I kind of highlighted the scores that are a 0 and a 0.25, right? So that doesn't mean you can't have an outlier. That's just generally kind of like the phase 1 scores that you would typically see down that rating 2. And so here if we were looking at an activity that was pre-made, we're going to be looking at things that you see on Cvi Connect or Facebook or YouTube or Perkins, or I mean, there's some on Pinterest, and you're seeing these things all over the place that are labeled CVI friendly, and they're just kind of out there, and we need to make sure we kind of sort them into the phases. And so I'm going to refer to this chart. It used to be referred to as the resolution chart, and the latest text is the progress chart, because we know that CVI does not actually resolve. And here, you're going to use this to kind of help facilitate what you would look for in a phase 1 activity. So for example, you might look for visual targets to be a single color, moving or have reflective movement-like properties. You might look for 3D targets, pair them with light. They might need to be a familiar target, likely that you need to have a strictly controlled background, meaning that you have that minimal array, no extra sensory inputs, presented pretty close, so within 12 inches of the learner. You might see the student has a prolonged latency and regards visual targets with the dorsal stream vision or their WARE vision. They might reach, or they're most likely to reach, is occurring as a separate event, and you'll want to try to use items to facilitate that would extend from the eye to hand. So even though they might not be using their eyes to help guide their visually guided reach, you're going to want to have something that would extend, so that if they did look at it and it did happen to hit their hand, so they can kind of make those connections. So for example, on this next slide, you see a student who is laying over what looks like a wedge on their stomach there, with a light box with beads hanging down. And so this is a great example of a phase 1 activity where it's paired with light, you have a real object, it's a single color, the reflective property of the beads make it the movement-like properties. Hopefully this is something that's familiar to the child, and it's extending from their eye to their hand, right? So you can see in this image that even if when the child picks his head up, that he's likely to be able to maybe reach and kind of engage with that, but it's also connecting his eyes down. So not all the time is there always going to be an activity that can be long enough, like these beads that can extend down. That's why a lot of times in phase 1, you'll see things like slinkies, because they can kind of extend down from that visual area down to where maybe their hands are being placed in their lap or on the side of their chair or what have you. That's why we like some of those longer things, but those aren't always available. And so in that case, you might have something where you might present one, you might have 2 of those items. So one that's in their visual field and one that's near their hands. So they might incidentally have exposure to that opportunity to feel what that object is that they look like, okay? What's really important when we're using activities in phase 1 is I want you to be thinking, how will I be able to use this in time to further advance the child's visual function? What's going to happen next? What's the intention behind this? I think too often I've seen, and I know I was guilty of it when I first started learning about CVI, I was like, yes, pom-poms, red mylar, let's do this. And what I was doing didn't really have a whole lot of meaning and intention behind it. And we need to make sure that we're being more intentional and purposeful when we are selecting the things that we're doing. So if red mylar is what gets their attention, in this case, we've got the red beads, then how are we going to be utilize that same characteristic, that same feature when we get to phase 2? And so we're going to start just here in this zone, but then figuring out like what would happen next, right? Another quote from Dr. Roman is, some students with CVI may seem to enjoy looking at scenes outside the window or novel pictures in books, but it's critical to recognize that looking at a target cannot be equated with interpreting what is seen. I think this is really just so eye-opening for so many people who are new to CVI, and even just a good reminder for those of us. I know there are several names on here that I've attended your sessions, and I learned so much from all of you, but I think it's just a good reminder too, to just say, just because they're looking does not mean that they are able to interpret what it is that's being seen. And so it's important that we tie in communication and other ways to understand and know whether or not the child is actually interpreting what's going on in the images here. And as we move from phase 1 to phase 2, our learners move from solely using their dorsal stream vision and begin to use their ventral stream vision. So again, dorsal stream vision is where vision and ventral stream vision is our what vision. So my best example of this, I learned, I want to say it was from Chris Russell. I always forget, but I'm pretty sure it was Chris Russell. I think this was like before the pandemic. So maybe 2019 that I was at a session with him. I think we were in Kansas or Missouri or something, but he did this example and it just was a very aha moment. So I'm going to share it with you and hopefully you can have that same aha moment if you haven't already between your dorsal and your ventral stream vision. Okay. So again, dorsal stream vision is your where vision. So I have this note card that I was writing some things down on, and I'm going to put it to my right side. Okay. So it's in my peripheral field. I can see where this is. I know that there is a note card here without even turning to look at it. It's in my peripheral field. I know where it is. If I were to move it up or down, I can still see where it is, okay? But I cannot see what is written on this note card without making eye to object contact. So again, even if it's in my lower field or my upper or the side, I'm not yet making eye to object contact with it. So I don't know what it is. I'm only using dorsal stream vision, okay? So to this note, I can see, and I might even like regard that it's over here. That doesn't mean I know what it is just yet, okay? Once I move that and I turn and make eye to object contact, I can now see what is on this card, all right? That still doesn't yet mean that I can interpret what it is. If this was some kind of, if it was a different language, or my husband's a big, is a histotechnologist and he's in science field. And if he were to draw a diagram of something he does at work, doesn't mean I'd be able to interpret what it was, right? Because it has nothing and no basis for me. It's not familiar to me at all. I have no background knowledge on it, no context of it. So I would have no idea what that is. So even though there's like 3 stages there. So we have our dorsal, we have that ventral with the eye to object contact, and then it's interpreting all of this that's going on inside of here. So it's really important that we set up those expectations and make sure that we're very reasonable with what we're asking of our students. So for example, if a student was in phase 1 and the IEP goal is for them to identify a certain shape or be able to read a sight word or identify a certain letter. They're only using dorsal stream vision, remember? So can we ask them to interpret and identify some of those things yet? It's not really aligning with the goal of where they're at with their vision. So we need to make sure that we're looking at those visual, that goal of the CVI phase, and what we're looking at expectationally for how they're using their vision to achieve those IEP goals. So maybe we need to find a different way to find those materials accessible at this point in time. The vision isn't quite there yet. Now let's move into phase 2. I did break this into early phase 2 and late phase 2, solely because I was trying to like clump everything into these 2 scores each, just because we expand it too far out. And phase 2 really kind of encompasses completely different kids from that early, as they're just coming out of phase 1 and before they go into phase 3. There's completely different kids there. So I wanted to sort it out a little bit just to give you some different examples. But when we go into the next activity where we're actually sorting, we're just going to call them phase 1. Phases 1, 2, and 3. We're not going to do early phase 2 and late phase 2. But in early phase 2, you're going to start to see that visual targets can be viewed with more than one color. Movement continues to be an important property to initiate and occasionally sustain visual attention for our learners. 3D is probably still preferred, but they might be able to begin to demonstrate eye to object contact with photographs of a familiar toy. Lighting paired with the target is still, highly needed at times. Familiar targets or objects that share characteristics of the familiar targets. So your environment is likely needing to still be in that preferred field, whichever one that is. You're going to have that controlled environment, meaning limited visual distractions and auditory or other sensory inputs. Your distance might be increased up to 2 to 3 feet at this point in time, but your student is still going to have a lot of latency. And it might decrease after they have a warm up. So after they've had a chance to kind of use their vision and get going a little bit. But their look and touch are still probably coming in as separate events. Okay. And then as we, whoops. Okay, let's try this again. What's going on? Okay, late phase 2, switching cards. Okay, so there is a link attached, by the way, that will go into these charts and kind of blow this picture up a little bit for you. But when we go into late phase 2, around the score of like a 5, students can start beginning to discriminate two-dimensional visual targets. And these would be like simple, realistic, two-dimensional images with highly saturated colors. You might need to begin color highlighting, and we'll talk about its purpose with that, making sure we're being meaningful again with these things. Movement continues to be important, and your lighted targets or maybe even backlit to help the targets. Your environment, your visual field preference is decreasing, and you might be able to start using additional fields. You might be able to see that the student is now tolerating some low background noise, so your environment might not be as controlled anymore, and you might be able to increase the distance, which means that your array is a little bit more expanded as well. So maybe up to 4 feet now, even more than that in some cases. For your student, you're going to see that the latency is probably more present when the child is stressed or stimulated. Their visual curiosity might be occurring in new environments. So all of a sudden you're starting to see them a little bit more excited when they go into the new place. They're just kind of visually checking it out, where before they might not have done that. And they might start to have a visually guided reach with some of their familiar toys, things that they're used to seeing. So here I have that familiar toy that we might have a picture of for the child. And so we might need to add movement to it when we have a picture of it in order to get their visual attention on it, right? And then slowly we can move over to putting some of those targets on the backlit device. So like having a picture on a backlit device of the toy that they're familiar with is a great way to build from having the child maybe in like a communication setting. So if you're having them to identify the toy that they want based on pictures, it might be helpful to put those on a backlit device like a tablet in order to help them identify or select the toy they want, and then go ahead and give them the toy as part of that communication system. So this is, these next 2 slides are kind of my, again, I'm going to walk you through my learning process, and hopefully you guys can learn from my thought process, I guess that I can say. This was a slide from Matt Tejan's presentation. And if you haven't ever watched any of Matt Tejan's presentations, you need to go Google him and watch. He actually has one on Perkins that is like their CVI for the TVI, What Do You See? It's a webinar that's available. And it's a great way to show that instead of asking the question of like, is this a car, or show me the cat, instead asking the child what they see and getting that response to understand how they're using their vision and how they're interpreting the things that you're presenting instead of giving them that visual target. So it's just a different level of thinking and understanding your student's vision a little bit differently. But I'm not even going to dare try to explain his session any better. He does an amazing job, has lots of great work out there. But this image, that this slide here, was taken from his presentation that he did at the Pediatric Cortical Visual Impairment Society back in 2018. I really need to look that up because I don't remember the exact year that he presented it. So I apologize. But I loved this progression that he showed here, and how you can go from the real object, and here you're getting color and luminance cues and visual texture and actual size and the salient features and context clues, all of that information to identify it. And then when you have a photograph, you're losing actual size and context clues. And then if you have an illustration, you lose even more. Now you only have color and salient features. But when we get to black and white drawings or illustrations of things, we only have the salient features available to us. So that's why it's so important when you hear Christine and so many others say, we need to teach the salient features. Because when you think about it, how many of us are able to provide real objects every time we go in and we're trying to teach a concept? Okay. How many times do schools say, sure, print as many color images as you want, especially photographs? Like, it's cool, no big deal. Most educational materials are black and white. Every worksheet these kids are getting, even books that they print at school for kids to access, are all in these black and white. They're usually very illustrative drawings. And so it makes it very hard for our learners to interpret what is going on. There's this strategy of reading when it's like, okay, if you get to a word you don't know, look at the picture and it'll help you, sort it out through that context clue. Well, our kiddos look at the picture and they're like, I still have no idea what's going on because I can't tell you what this picture is of. And so now they're struggling even more. And they just kind of continue to slip through the cracks if they're not identified and they're just not provided the accessible content. So I had this moment of just making things way more complicated than it really needed to be. But I think it's good to kind of show this. And Judy Endicott is on this session and she's probably laughing because I think she remembers having this conversation with me. But between reading Dr. Roman's texts and Matt Tejan's assessments, and then I was taking Judy Endicott's class through Perkins on the literacy program that she was, the literacy for kids with CVI. And I was really thinking to myself, like, oh my goodness, how do I make sure that all of our students have real objects presented in isolation? And then as soon as they learn that, now we want to give them something else that is similar to that familiar item, but just slightly different. So I go from like their known stuffed animal cat to another type of stuffed animal cat. And then I'm going to give them a realistic image of a real cat, and I'm going to outline it with the highlighting of the salient features in red. And then I'm going to remove the highlighting because you always want to start to reduce the accommodations that you're making. So now I've got a picture of a real cat. And then I go to more cats, but now they look different. So they still have whiskers and they still have the triangle shaped ears, but they're not the exact same as the original cat I had. And then I talk about other animals that also have some similarities, but are not a cat, and making sure we understand that this one is not considered a cat, so something to compare it to, right? Now I'm going to get into illustrations, and then I'm going to get, oh my goodness, can you imagine if you had to do this with every concept? And I was like thinking that I had this kind of like figured all out. And then I was taking, and this was just up to images at this point in time, and I created this originally of like what I wanted to do, this workflow in my head as I'm creating Cvi Connect activities and how I want to make sure I present it for all of our learners. And then I thought, the word cat has that same shape every single time you make it, right? So every single time I present the word cat, it's very static. It's the same, as long as I'm using the same font, it has that same shape, which is wonderful. And so while yes, I need to be aware that this order transcends, and that if the child knows this as cat, as the red stuffed cat, if they know that as a cat, that doesn't mean that they're going to know that this outline is a cat as well, unless they're taught along the way and we're giving them examples. So for some examples, you might have to go through some of these steps, and this is kind of how it transcends through from black and white and color, and how those different things can help us identify it. And if you're not sure what your salient features are, a great way to do it is to look it up and say, cat coloring picture, cat outline, and see, what do you notice? And then you can say, okay, well, the triangle shaped ears are here, and I know that that's a cat, and I see the tail here, so maybe that's one of my salient features. So that might be a way for you to identify some of those salient features before you do your instruction. But this doesn't mean that you have to go through every single one of these steps in order for your student to know what a cat is and learn catness. Like there's a level there that we kind of have to find that happy medium from what is realistic and what's the most meaningful for my student. If we don't have a cat in the house right now, and we're maybe not even reading a cat book, I don't know how much of all of this is necessary. What's the purpose behind it? What are we trying to achieve? It's great if we are reading a book that has the word cat in it and we want to talk about the images that are in the book and how we know that it's a cat and things like that. Excellent, because it has purpose behind it. But we can't just expect ourselves to go through these steps in this process without meaning. Okay. And as we move into phase 3, our students are now able to, they almost function and they appear to function like a child without CVI. Sometimes this is where it's hard to get the IEP team or people who are less familiar to understand where CVI is still playing a role and still having that impact. Dr. Roman has taught us that CVI is a lifelong condition and will continue to access their impact the access to education. And it's going to continue to impact them lifelong. And so we need to understand the student and make sure that they understand too, so they can begin to advocate for what they need moving forward. This is where I would start to see in phase 3 that color highlighting. Your movement might be, not required anymore, but it could be helpful. So in this example of the CVI overlay, as Judy Endicott calls it, if I was doing a fluency activity and I wanted to get the reader to understand the pattern of the sentence, I might use movement to kind of highlight and say, the dog ran in the park and chased after the ball. So it kind of shows the student and highlights how that pacing can happen in the sentence and give them an example. So it may not be required, but it still might be helpful to get their attention where you need it and be a tool to help facilitate that learning opportunity. You might notice that some pictures are regarded at this point in time, and some novel objects might be able to be discriminated based on those similar or salient features in comparative thought. Okay, so we've talked about salient features a couple times. I brought this up, so I want to make sure we're all on the same page. Here's a picture of an elephant. Why is it an elephant? How do you know it's an elephant? I had a family, I was sitting at my daughter's gymnastics class one night, and this father and son were sitting in front of me, and he had his little plastic animals, and the little boy would grab the little elephant or other animal and would say, like, oh, Dad, the elephant's gonna get you. And jokingly, the dad's like, that's not an elephant. And he's like, yeah, it is. And he's like, no, it's not. And the little boy was insistent. Yes, it's an elephant. The dad goes, yeah, how do you know? And I was sitting there and I'm like, I love that question. Like, this is a game. This is a family who probably has never even heard of CVI in their life. But as I'm sitting there reading my book and doing things while my kids are in gymnastics, I'm like, I just love that. This moment of like, how do you know? And the child is going through and saying, well, look, it has the elephant it has a trunk and it's gray. And he's like identifying different features of it. And it's almost like taking all that information and then taking it down to like that outline drawing, like I talked about earlier, and thinking of like 2 to 3 features. How do I know it's an elephant? Pick 2 to 3 things, and those are your salient features. Are they still going to be seen if I have an outline, black and white drawing, no color? That's my salient feature, okay? Those are the things you then want to highlight. That's when we talk about, when you see in Dr. Roman's book, and she'll say, highlighting might be necessary, but this is what she's talking about. So if your student isn't seeing the trunk when you talk about it, maybe you show your finger, you draw a line on it, or what have you, you can use color to bring attention to it. It would be no different than as a presenter, if I were to, see if I can get my mouse to participate. If I really wanted you to see this dictionary site, I can circle it in red, and now you see exactly what I'm talking about. If I had a bunch of things on the page and you weren't seeing what I was talking about as a presenter, I can use this tool of movement on my screen with shaking my mouse where it's at, or I can draw something to draw your attention to it. I can underline things. These are all educational tools that we've been using for a long time. But this is what we're talking about, and being more intentional and purposeful with this type of strategy for our learners with CVI, because it's going to get their attention, and we need to make sure that we're utilizing that when necessary. If everything on this page was underlined and I drew circles around everything, that's not helpful. Now you have no idea what I'm talking about with where I want you to look. It's all just kind of a hodgepodge of red highlighting in kind of chaos. And so you need to make sure that when you're doing it, you're only highlighting where you want their attention to go. Or if there is a certain time where I want you to look in different parts, I need to get rid of the other highlighting before I come in and highlight something new. Okay. I need to make sure I turn this annotation feature off so I don't keep drawing all over everything as we continue through our presentation. So when we talk about comparative thought, oh, see, there is still a line on there. I thought I got rid of it. Okay, now it's gone. Okay, when you hear comparative thought, let's understand what this means. Think about your Venn diagram. Think about something that the child knows and what it is that you're trying to teach them. So we had a situation where we had a student who was very familiar with their spoon, but we needed them to learn toothbrush. And so we thought, okay, we taught them the salient features of spoon, which is the long handle and the curved scoop. And now they are working on their bathroom routine, and they need to know their toothbrush. So we're going to use that as like their icon to show that's where it's time to go. We need to know what to do. So here, you can think about those same features, and we're thinking it's a long handle and bristles. And so now what we're going to do is make that connection in the middle. They both have a long handle, but the difference is the toothbrush has small bristles and the spoon has the curved scoop. I'm seeing in the chat that you guys aren't able to get the salient feature link, and I will try to post it at the end. So I see that is in the comment, and I'll try to go back and copy and paste it at the end so you guys have it. You might even be able to Google it. It's a collaboration of teams working together to, let me jump back over here. Sorry. Okay, so that website there is a collaboration from Matt Tejan, I believe, where he's had a variety of people putting into like a public forum where everyone can kind of put their ideas in. So if you're not sure what your salient features might be and you just don't have a good jumping off place, it's a great tool to kind of check out and see if those salient features would work for your student. But you need to make sure when you're picking those 2 to 3 features that they're very meaningful for your student. If the vocabulary that somebody else uses isn't meaningful for your student or isn't at their level, then it just won't make sense. And so you got to make sure you pick something that's meaningful to them. Okay. So again, here you're going to build on that child's thought. I can see why you might think it's a spoon because they both have a long handle, but the difference is, and then kind of give that example. So in this case, we already knew that they knew spoon, and we wanted to build on that and give them the idea of toothbrush. Or if you use Nat Tejan's philosophy of asking them, what do you see? And they call a toothbrush a spoon. That's another example of how you can put your Venn diagram together and say, okay, you called it a spoon, but it's actually a toothbrush. I can see why you might think that it's a spoon because they both have a long handle, and then point out the difference. So here's an example of an activity that was used, and it gives you a prompt there with some salient feature vocabulary that you can use. But in the activity, we drew and outlined or highlighted rather, the long handle for both the toothbrush and the spoon. Gave each of them their own color so that you could really see the differences between the two. And then we talked about their differences, with the spoon having that scoop and the toothbrush having the round bristles. Okay, so now we're gonna play a little game. I need you all to be ready to type in your chat box. If you don't have that up, go ahead and get that up now. What we're gonna do is I'm gonna show you an image And I'm going to give you some background information. So the clue is to listen carefully to some of the things I'm saying, because it's going to be based on some of the things I already discussed. But some of the things that I might say might help support you in making your decision. You're going to choose phase 1, 2, or 3. So you just need to type in the chat box 1, 2, or 3. So here is a picture from the blog Everyday CVI. So it's a blog that a mom writes. She's got some great ideas and includes some things where she's demonstrating the use of, like here, she's got the use of Mylar stuck to the spoon, and she's trying to encourage visual attention during this mealtime. So think back to phases that which phase would achieve this goal that she's working on here. Go ahead and type in phase 1, 2, or 3. I got lots of phase 1 coming in. I do have one phase 2. Okay, so I interpreted this as a phase 2 activity because she's integrating vision with function. So again, it's all about meaning and purpose for what you're looking for your student. Also, the image demonstrates that the child is expected to pair, so they're expected to pair vision with function during mealtime. This directly relates to that goal in phase 2. I could see it working for a child in late phase 1, but I think in this case, the parent did an excellent job of utilizing the characteristic that gains their attention in phase 1. So single color, Mylar material. So it's imitating that movement to the brain. They're also faced away from the window, so they're kind of controlling the environment a little bit more. You can see in that closer image on the last slide where the baby's has some pretty good eye-to-object contact. So that alone tells me that we're kind of out of phase 2 because now we're getting that eye-to-object contact. That's that ventral stream vision, okay? So for me, I interpreted this as phase 2 activity. Now, this picture is an image from the Perkins website, another great resource that I'm sure many of you have heard about, and they have lots of courses for CVI. And here, the environment seems to be very controlled. You can see in the background that it's all black. The child's head is turned toward the Mylar object, but it almost looks like they're looking through it or just past the object. So is this a phase 1, 2, or 3? Lots of phase 1 coming in. All right, perfect. So I also said that this is probably most appropriate for a student who's in phase 1, as it is not directly related to the function or the refinement of the characteristics. In a task like this, we're looking to build visual behavior. If you look closely at her eyes, like I said, her head is turned and she's just demonstrating that classic, like looking through the target. It's like she's looking just past it. So her head is kind of turned toward the item, but she's not really making eye-to-object contact at this point in time. And that's pretty classic for a student who's in phase 1. Okay. This next image is from the Pediatric Cortical Visual Impairment Society. And if you haven't already, definitely should check out their website. It's great tools, and they share some they have great tools to share with medical professionals, educators, and families. The image here shows a backlit device with a picture of a toy, and that child is holding the same toy in front of them. And so to me, it looks like they're building some activity for communication and starting to kind of build that into that next step. So think back to when we talked about when kids are moving from the real object to realistic images of the real object. When would that be for phase 1, 2, or 3? Lots of 2s and 3s. Now, I said that most likely this was for phase 2 because here we are demonstrating the bridge from that real item to pairing it with its 2-dimensional image on the backlit device. So it's likely a phase 2 activity. I did see someone just say late phase 2, and yeah, I would have to agree that that's probably where you're seeing that come into play. we would expect a child to participate in this activity to be able to make eye-to-object contact and sustain visual attention. So that would take us out of phase 1. And we would encourage a team to do something like this in an effort to build capacity for future AAC devices, as well as potentially building pre-literacy. So it's a great way to do both of those things. This next image is shared by the Bridge Schools website. Yet again, another great resource for understanding how to support children with CVI and complex communication needs. So in this image, you have a student who has access to letters of the alphabet, but only 4 of them at a time. So you can see the array on the bottom of the screen has the letters U, S, G, and H. And then above that, the image shows that the word A, or the letters A, G, G, I think, are selected at the top. So where do you think this would fit? Phase 1, 2, or 3? Excellent. So I clicked that a little bit soon. Sorry, guys. I did not mean to click it so fast. But most of you guys were saying phase 3, and I agree. It's an activity that is 2-dimensional. It's accessed with backlighting. And to me, this activity would fall into phase 3 due to the complexity of it and the material that it's being presented on. So this child is not only able to identify letters individually, she's expected to, utilize this array and probably select from that array, which is definitely more complex, that she's able to interpret all of those and select accordingly in order to communicate. So we've now collected our data, we've analyzed it, and now we kind of have an idea of what a good activity is for each phase. And we talked about earlier, that's not enough though, right? Because even 2 kids in phase 2 or 2 kids in phase 3, their things are going to look completely different, and it isn't okay. I mean, even in those 2 examples, I gave you 2 for phase 2, right? And those 2 kids are using phase 2 activities, but they're completely different in how purposeful and how meaningful they are. And so we can't just take something that's called phase 2 and give it to a kid. Just like we can't take something that said, oh, it's CVI friendly or it has CVI available to you, doesn't mean that it's always going to be accessible for your student. So Christine Roman, in her book, again, I'm going to quote her, said, but mere exposure to visual input is not sufficient for individuals with CVI. We have to be more intentional, more purposeful, okay? So for me, I look at it like the stepping stone. And so first, the classroom teacher assigns a task, or wherever they get their curriculum from, they're given that assigned task that the student needs to work on, or if it's in early childhood, you have that benchmark that you're working towards, or that activity that you're expecting the student to achieve, okay? And then the next thing you would need to do is align that content to meet the student's needs. So that would be that modifying curriculum, that part we're not going to get into too much today. But that would need to happen next. And once you've done that, once you've decided how it directly relates to this student's needs and how they're moving forward, that's when you need to align the visual input to meet the student's needs. So this is where we would be accommodating the images and the text and the activity, whatever items, the manipulatives that you're using to use for the student. So this would be my visual map for creating access. And we're going to revisit this again in a second. But to me, this slide represents, that whole process that we're going through for our learners. And as teachers for the visually impaired, we're required to do a learning media assessment for all of our students on our caseload. And up until recently, that learning media assessment was something that we use with our students who have that ocular loss, but we didn't have a tool that we kind of considered the 10 visual and behavioral characteristics. And Matt Tejan and Dr. Roman Lancy put together this sensory balance workbook, and it is fantastic for helping you understand the CVI balance for how to use that auditory input. So if you look at this image here, you'll see that For a student who's in phase 1, you might start off with primarily tactual and auditory access, but then as this transcends into phase 2 and phase 3, we're going to eventually use more vision. You can see that the vision bar grows a little bit. So here in phase 1, you have primarily that tactual and auditory, and then it gets more and more vision access as you get into phase 2 and 3, right? So most children in phase 1 are in their early years, and that's when the brain has most plasticity, and we need to utilize this. And if we are able to balance the learner's contents and the things that they're looking at, we're going to be able to achieve that and get through phase 1 much quicker and give them opportunities to use their vision for their growth much earlier on. And depending on which study you look at, there's several out there over the years, but if they say that 80 to 90% of what a learner learns is through vision. And so the faster we can get them to that visual opportunity, those opportunities to use vision to learn, the better off they will be, because we do live in a very visual world and it's kind of expected. And so the faster we can kind of get them to that point, the more accessible they're going to find some things, and it's easier to find accessible content for them. Not totally easy, but easier. So if you're not familiar with Matt Tejan's work around the complexity framework, again, I'm going to give you another suggestion to go watch another webinar. Not going to try to explain something that he has any better than he has already done. But in a very brief synopsis, that Matt tells us we need to evaluate the task that we're expecting the student to complete and the environment in which they're completing the task. And so the evaluation of the task and the environment, the team will utilize these 2 charts and circle the level for each component. And the highest circle will determine the overall complexity. And so, for example, you might find that a student in the general ed classroom, where the environment is more complex, the learner with CVI can only handle maybe an array of like 2 items. Where if they were to go down to a resource room or have a more controlled placement, they might be able to successfully interpret an array of up to 6 items. And so same child, same task, but they might be able to do more complex tasks in a less complex environment. So you kind of have to balance the 2 items together. So using this, it's our job to not only provide accessible content, but also a CVI-friendly, accessible school day. And this is going to help avoid that visual fatigue and any potential meltdowns, making sure you're finding a balance throughout the day. So I would look at each activity that you have throughout the day that you're requesting that they use their vision. So after you've done your learning media assessment and you've decided these are the times throughout the day that we're going to use vision to be accessible. Now for each of those times, that vision as an access point, you need to kind of figure out what's that balance to make sure. And then you also need to make sure those are spread out enough so you're not doing like, we're doing everything visual in the morning and then nothing in the afternoon, or vice versa, where you're like, we're not gonna do anything visual in the morning and then all of a sudden expect them to use their vision all afternoon nonstop with no breaks. You're likely going to deplete that visual battery, as Matt calls it, and then they're not going to be able to complete those tasks and become much more frustrational for them. So for example, if I were to try to explain all of the information about this chart and read this off to you and you've never seen it before while all this background noise is going around, it's probably pretty difficult for you. You're probably pretty distracted. And even if I were to add lights and movement and make it pretty and simplify that simple task for you, doesn't mean that you're going to understand it any better. And so it's our job, even if I wiggle it, it's not going to necessarily make it easier when all of that stuff is going on in the background. It's our job to make sure that we provide a really good balance. So let me show you an example. Here we have a young girl who has a controlled environment. A blackboard is in front of her, but the task at hand has a lot going on. It's pretty overwhelming for her. So even though the environment is controlled, it's quiet, there's no other distractors, the task is super frustrational for her. And for that reason, she's not able to complete it. So we've done all the right things for the environment, but not the task. Now, in this example, the task is more comfortable. It's something she's familiar with. But the environment is only moderately controlled. She doesn't need that blackout board. It is quiet in the room. And the room, she's sitting on the couch, and the room in front of her is actually picked up, but it isn't blocked out. I didn't need to completely block her view from any of those things. And now take a look.
Can you show me what we do with the word can? Yeah, can you do that? Yeah. Drag it in there. Drag it to its puzzle piece. Good job. Let's practice our word the. Drag it for me. Good job. Go ahead and press the next page. Good. Do you see any more thes on the page? Okay, if you see any that are not the, can you drag them up to this not sign? Remember, that's our no. It's a circle with a line through it. Now, what is, like, for the example, is this the word the? No. So instead of dragging it to the, remember, we're going to drag it to the no button. So drag it up to no.
Okay, so here you can see that she was more comfortable with that. She was able to see her sight words and sort them out. And the activity was something that was familiar to her. So we've gone through, we had given her explicit instruction on those words. She knew what they were, and she knew what they were in the workbook as well, but it was just a lot more frustrating for her. So now that we've modified the task and met the learner's need as far as the task and the environment, now we need to make sure that we provide instruction. And this part, I think, is super key for our learners with CVI. And yes, that's the Cvi Connect app. So the app that you're going to see throughout my presentation is the Cvi Connect app that I'm with. But I will also show you examples that are not on the Cvi Connect app, so you know. With the instruction, it's really important that, let me go back. If you had a Braille reader, for those of you who are in the vision world, or any student at all, you wouldn't just drop a textbook off or materials off that are in their accessible format. So even if I did highlight things, or even if I did provide Braille to the Braille reader, or the right level book to a first grader, I wouldn't just drop it off and walk away. There has to be instruction that happens there. We all saw this during COVID when we were all at home, and so many students across the country, their scores just plummeted because they didn't have that constant and explicit instruction that they needed access to. And even our gen ed kids that were just so struggling with that constant connection, that person to give them that explicit instruction. And our students with CVI are no different. They're requiring that instruction to understand what it is that they're seeing and knowing how to access this material that you've put in front of them. And so we need to be really intentional behind this. And once you have that, then you have access for your student with CVI. So when we talk about explicit instruction, we need specialized instruction to learn how to utilize those customized material. It's more than accommodating the content and handing it over. The child must be taught how to interpret that display. And so it's important for the IEP team to figure out and plan who this is provided by. So is there someone already on the team that does this, or is there someone else available to do this? Do you need to hire someone specifically for this role? Your student is accessing curriculum and using unique tools and language and needs to be explicitly taught from someone on that team in order to know how to use it. So, all right, in this next activity, I'm going to give you an example of a student, and then I'm going to give you some choices of things that might need to be done for that student. And this is a good opportunity for conversation as well, because I'm only going to give you like bits and pieces about the student. So feel free to have conversation about this information, but afterwards you're just basically going to select A, B, C, or D and select which option you think would be most appropriate for the student, okay? So our first student is Ahmed, and I know that font is really small, so I'm going to read to you the highlighted areas that are most important to you, but I wanted to jam it into one slide. So I'm going to make it accessible, I promise. I know that the way it's presented is not ideal. But Ahmed is our first student. He's 5 years old. He receives vision, orientation mobility, OT, speech, and special ed services. His class is preparing to go to the zoo, and we need to figure out what can be done for Ahmed before he goes to the zoo. So this is Ahmed's rating 2 CVI rating score. And so you see he has a 0.5 for color, and that indicates that he needs color highlighting for salient 3D and two-dimensional features. And if I scan down to the complexity of an object, he needs two-dimensional images without backlighting are now accessible. Simple two-dimensional images can be detected, and targets at a distance of up to 6 feet can be detected. Locate and visually fixate on targets that are up to 6 feet away. So if we're going to go to the zoo with Ahmed, we need to figure out what to do. So would you, A, provide no visual accommodation needed? He will participate using auditory or tactile input. B, multiple occasions before the trip, show Ahmed a toy animals that he may see at the zoo. Present them on a light box with a highly controlled background. Bring these toy animals to the zoo to hand to Ahmed throughout the day. C, on multiple occasions prior to the zoo field trip day, present real photographs to highlight salient features of the different animals. Present on a tablet and add movement as necessary. Bring the tablet to the zoo the day of the field trip. Or D, show printed pictures of various animals. Bring to a device to the zoo, take pictures of the animals, and zoom in. What do you think would be most appropriate for this learner, Ahmed, who's 5 years old? How would you handle it? And you might have a different idea, but those are just some examples so that we could have conversation and go from it. Lots of people chiming in with C or B. C or D. All right. So I did indicate that I would say C in this one. On multiple occasions prior to the zoo field trip day, I would present real photographs and highlight salient features of the different animals, present them on a tablet, and add movement if necessary. And I would bring that tablet with us to the zoo the day of the field trip. And so here is an example of what this activity might look like. Here we've got an elephant, and then I think this video will screw you there. So you've got the highlighting of the flappy ear and the trunk, and then we would actually show different directions the trunk might be pointed in. And so this would be one way that you could provide access to them. So I'm going to go back to the example, the different opportunities we had here. The reason I did not choose the miniatures is because there are a lot of studies that show that miniatures can actually be confusing for kids unless you make sure that you identify them as, this is a toy elephant, this is a toy whatever. So making sure that concept is available to be known. And then lastly, I don't know about you guys, but when I go to the zoo, I can't always be sure that number one, the printed pictures of the various animals in D, I didn't think would be the best way to be accessible for the student because they were printed. So I thought having a backlit device would be a better option. And then also, you're not always going to be in a position where you can take pictures that are of a great view of the animal and zoom in. And so that's a great idea in a pinch, but it might not always work just because you might not be able to get that good image. And so that's why I went with the C. So this is our next student. Our next student is Isabella. I see now Lisa said, and add some of the animal sounds to the slide. So I do like that as a teaching moment, but I do also want to add that animal sounds are not visual salient features because we want to make sure that we keep that information separate. So I like that idea, but I also just feel responsible to make sure that everyone knows that when you're teaching animals, there is a point and purpose like we would for any learner to teach the animal sounds. But when we're specifically teaching the explicit instruction for visual access, we don't want to think about the sounds that something would make because that's auditory. So when we're looking at the salient features of that item, we're looking at 2 to 3 visual things that you can visually see. Any other information you want to talk about it, how it feels, any other sensory input is great and fantastic for the student to know, but make sure that that isn't one of your visual salient features that you're identifying when you're doing your instruction. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, please feel free to ask me questions about it. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and jump into our next student. Our next student is Isabella, and Isabella is 10 years old. She receives PT, OT, speech, vision, and O&M services. And it is difficult for Isabella to use her vision. We need to figure out what can be done with her throughout the day. So the team knows that she attends to the single color yellow, and she attends to objects that are moving or have movement-like properties. She only can attend to single color objects and only one item at a time. So the array needs to be very controlled. Does best with things that have lighted property or presented with lights. And it needs to be presented at a near location, so within 12 inches. So here, the team is trying to figure out what do we do to help her with her vision throughout her day. We know she has vision, but we're not really sure what to do. So they say, do we say no visual accommodations are necessary? She will participate in school with either tactile or auditory modalities. B, the team should provide a schedule for each positioning opportunity. Select a yellow moving visual target and present on Isabella's right side. C, use yellow or gold shiny material on a switch, shine a flashlight, and gently move from behind the student onto the switch to encourage her to use her vision to locate the switch before hitting. Or D, use yellow letters with glitter on them to teach her the letter of the week with her peers. It's really important that you think back to what we talked about before regarding the goal of the phase that the child is in at this point in time too, and how they're accessing their visual function at this point in time. So are they using dorsal or ventral stream vision at this point in time? Lots of people saying B. I do have a C. Anyone else want to chime in? We're all here to learn, everybody. We can chime in, and it's good to know where everyone's at so that we can have these conversations. And if I haven't fully explained something, that I might be able to re-explain it and kind of go back. So that's why I have these opportunities in here too. So feel free, if I afterwards and I explain it, still doesn't make sense to you, ask me, please, because we're all here to learn together. So I did choose B for this activity because that student's scores indicated that they were in a phase 1. So if I go back, and I know I didn't read off all their scores to you, but things like single object, controlled environment, only yellow, movement properties, lighted, near distance, all of that is things for a student who is in phase 1. And so I guess depending on how big your screen is right now, you may or may not be able to see, but the scores were 0, 0, 0, 0.25, 0, 0.25, 0.25, 0, 0.25. So all of them are within that realm. That's that score of into a phase 1. So for that reason, our goal here is to get that building visual attention. And so here we would want to present, schedule a time throughout the day where they would have opportunity to use that yellow moving visual target and present it on her preferred side. So an activity like this one on the iPad where there's lots of yellow moving, things like that, just opportunities for her to kind of see something and then move on. And then I might use some of these characteristics again in phase 2 to do something like attach it to the switch or, and, kind of move it from behind. I love that idea of adding the Mylar to the switch and using the flashlight behind her to kind of get her to use her vision first before hitting the switch. Love that idea. That would be what I would move towards next if I could get her to look at something that was gold and shiny in phase 1. So I could kind of use that. Remember, we talked about what's next. So if I was doing those gold Mylar things in phase 1, my what's next is attaching it to something like a switch so she can have access to it. Please feel free to chime in if you guys have any questions about that. All right, our next student is Alex, and Alex is 8 years old. He receives special education services, vision, OT, and orientation mobility. One of Alex's goals is to increase the words he is reading in isolation and in context. What can be done to accommodate this goal? So here we have that he is scoring, a 1 in color, a 1 in movement, 0.75 in latency, 0.75 in fields. For complexity, he needs images that are, images have 4+ colors, patterns, and surface that is 2-dimensional. So 2-dimensional images without backlighting are now accessible. For the array, he can have up to 20 additional elements. Continuing down, his 0.75 for light and distance, a 1 for reflexes, a 0.75 for novelty, and a 1 for visually guided reach. So in novelty, he's identifying things that are visually discriminant or basically looking at those salient features that he's familiar with, even in some of those new environments. So for him, are we going to say A, no visual accommodations are necessary? Alex will participate with only auditory and tactile modalities. B, isolate the goal word and teach Alex the salient features. Begin to integrate the word into sentences. Only highlight the goal word, eventually removing all highlight accommodations when Alex is ready. C, present text on a backlit device with movement in highly controlled environment. Utilize Dr. Roman's word bubbling to highlight every word in the sentence. D, provide Alex with a hard copy of a book that addresses the goal word. Words may be presented with pictures in the background without additional modifications. What do you guys think? A, B, C, or D? So there's little bits and pieces that are kind of in these sentences that may trick you because some of them sound okay, but some of it does not. And so it's kind of like finding the right one, right? Lots of people chiming in with B. And I love it because I would isolate the goal word and teach that to Alex with the salient features, and then I would integrate it into sentences. So here's an example of how the goal word was window. And so we have a picture of a window, and then we give instructions for whoever's working with the child to indicate, here's the word with that bubbling, and give them an idea. We can highlight the salient features on the picture. And then we can move into the next picture where he has to now choose which one is correct and highlight it and drag it up to its outline. And then eventually we're going to get into those sentences. And then finally, what we want to do is get into a point where we can remove all accommodations. So here's working on spelling of that activity and dragging it up. And lastly, we always want to be able to get to, like I said, to that point where we can remove that feature and still have that so he can still identify the word even without that highlighting on there. Pretty sure the next slide goes into stop the recording. But so then now it would go into the sentences without even, window would not even be highlighted at all. So it would say, I see a tree out the window without the word bubbling at all around it. Okay, we are quickly running out of time, so I just want to explain this quick little sheet to you guys. I'm sorry that I didn't get through all of my slides, but this is just a little quick cheat sheet that I created for your implementation. So just asking some questions to yourself and your team to make sure that you're meeting those needs of your learners. So does your activity require modifications? Yes or no? Make sure you take care of it. What are the goals of your students' CVI phase? Make sure you're aligning your activity with that. If you're going to be using vision, you want to make sure it's aligning with that goal of the CVI phase. What are your students' IEP goals? Oops. What learning media is most appropriate for that activity? Does the accommodation match the Cvi range score? Go back and review that. What's the complexity chart with both the environment and the task? Make sure you align it with that. Who on the team is going to be responsible for accommodating these materials? Assign that person. Get that situated for you guys. Is specialized instruction or pre-teaching needed? And who's responsible for this, and when, where will it take place? What does the environment need to look like where the instruction will take place? So what kinds of noises, textures, lights, etc. So sensory is not just sound. We always think of it as sound, but it's all of it. Smells, everything. What kinds of things need to be considered? What's going on there that might impact your learner? Where is your student sitting in regard to presentation material? And along with that, does positioning impact the student? So where they're sitting in the classroom physically, but also what kind of position are they in? Are they in their wheelchair? Are they laying on their back? Are they in a stander? What's the position that they might be in? And how does that potentially impact their use of vision or other modality at that point in time? Happy to answer any other questions you guys might have. If you flip through the rest of the slides, you will see kind of that question. And then some examples that you guys can kind of just flip through on your own of, a stoplight activity and then a stoplight activity we created to make accessible for a student in phase 1. And then someone who's in phase 2, taking this constellation worksheet and making it accessible for a student who was in phase 2, and then moving forward from there. So lots of just examples of making content going from that worksheet to accessibility for our students. And then there's some great resources for how I reduce the complexity of those images and using some different tools that you might have at your exposure to make things accessible for your students. So I'm sorry again that I got cut a little short, but thank you all so much for joining me today. It's truly an honor to be here.